Shikues të nderuar, sonte kemi mundësinë që të bisedojmë me një musafir të veçantë, është emision special dhe me ne është një nga, do ta quajmë lirisht, heronjët e luftës së Kosovës, por jo heronjët tonë kosovar, po prej Shtetet Bashkuara të Amerikës. Është generali i cili udhëhoqi fushatën e NATO-s kundër Serbisë në vitin 1999, e cila rezultoi me çlirimin, them ashtu, të Kosovës dhe me parandalimin e spastrimit etnik. Me ne është pra sonte generali i pensionuar Wesley Clark. General, do you like us to call you General still, even though you are retired?
Well, we keep the title.
Okay, General, welcome.
But I don't use it in business usually.
Okay.
But for here, yes.
We just started by mentioning and reminding the audience, our audience, that you are known here as a hero of the war of 1999. You've led the campaign, the NATO campaign, a bombing campaign, which resulted with preventing the ethnic cleansing in Kosovo and also with liberation of the country, which is today an independent one. How do you feel about that? Do you recall the time frequently, and how do you feel today, 20 years after?
Well, I'm very proud to see the progress that's being made here. Makes me feel very good about the efforts of NATO and the United States to give Kosovars a chance to have their own country. It didn't start out that way. It started as an effort to prevent another war in the Balkans, honestly, and to prevent ethnic cleansing. I'd been to Albania as NATO commander. I hadn't been inside Kosovo because Milosevic never wanted to discuss Kosovo during the Dayton peace process. He always said, this is an internal matter. So we could never really talk about Kosovo. And I flew to Macedonia to see the U.S. task force that was on the border with Kosovo, or with, at the time, Serbia. And I landed in February or early March, I think, maybe the 3rd or 4th of March, 1998. And Macedonian President Gligorov wanted to see me. And he told me something really bad is going to happen in Kosovo because the Serbs have murdered this Jashari family. He said, and the Kosovars will fight. You can't treat them that way. He said, so something bad is going to happen. And it did. And it mobilized the Kosovar Albanian population. It provided an incentive for the Serbs to intensify their campaign against human rights workers, doctors, and lawyers in Kosovo. And by the May of 1998, the Albanian military told me that they could they could be on Mount Postrik and looking over into Kosovo. They could see the mortar rounds falling on some of these Kosovar villages in western Kosovo. And so NATO determined it had to do something to stop this. And that was the genesis of the NATO action. Milosevic was so carried away with his military campaign that it became clear that the only reasonable objective of our NATO effort was to stop the military campaign. And it was so brutal, the ethnic cleansing, by March of 1999, that the only reasonable objective was the Serbs' military, police, administration had to leave.
What do you say?
So that's how this started.
Yeah. You also met personally as part of the delegation with Mr. Holbrooke at the time, with Milosevic, to try to persuade him. What do you feel about that time? I mean, do you feel that it was time lost because people were also dying on the ground since 1998
to 1999? Well, I think in the summer of 1998, NATO tried to persuade Milosevic to stop. I remember Holbrooke was with him, and they put a call through to me, and I spoke to Milosevic. And I said, Mr. President, let's don't do ethnic cleansing here and start another Bosnia in your own province of Serbia, in your own country of Serbia, in Kosovo. And he said, General Clark, he said, please, he said, these are my people. I would not harm them. Of course, he was saying this at the same time that the ethnic cleansing was going on.
Yeah. Well, we do remember then the 1999 bombing campaign.
You know, well, this was 98.
Yes.
You know, by September of 98, President Murray of Estonia told me, he said, all of Europe is watching Milosevic as he's prosecuting the ethnic cleansing against the Kosovar people. He said, if NATO has any credibility left, it must take action and stop this.
Did all the other allies felt the same? Did they feel that this has to be done, the allies within the NATO?
So, yes and no. The French and German foreign ministers in the summer of '98 said, really nothing can be done without a UN Security Council resolution. And I think the Russians told President Milosevic, don't worry, we'll make sure there's no UN Security Council resolution. But in fact, there was a resolution dealing with the humanitarian crisis. Some 400,000 Kosovar Albanians had fled their villages, were living in the mountains, and it was going to get cold. Babies were being born up there. People were dying. They were afraid to be in their villages because of the campaign of ethnic cleansing coming through. So we did have a UN Security Council resolution in September of 1998 that authorized all member states to take action. And that was the basis for which NATO then began to try to mobilize and take action.
Then we have the 1999 spring, which erupted after the peace conference, which Serbia refused to sign
Right.
the agreement. And of course, in the eyes and minds of Kosovar citizens and the population here, there are just few names that are being attached to the decision of hitting Serbia with bombs. Among those are, of course, President Clinton and Secretary Albright, and of course it's yours. How did you feel when you were given the green light, so to speak, by then Secretary General of NATO, Solana?
Well, there really wasn't much in the way of feeling. I just hoped it would be over quickly, but there was no way of knowing. In 1998, in August, we'd had a meeting of all the commanders, the four-star commanders with President Clinton. The commander of the Pacific Command, the commander of the Central Command, the commander of the North American Defense Command, Space Command, Transportation Command. President Clinton went around the table saying something personally to each of the commanders. When he came to me, he said, Wes, you'll take care of the Kosovars, right? And I said, yes, Mr. President, I'll do my best. So I was given that mission by President Clinton.
How do you feel after completing the mission?
Well, when we completed the mission was never actually completed. It was always a work in progress. You know, I made 3 trips to negotiate with Milosevic in the fall of '98 to try to persuade him to pull his forces out. And then apparently a Russian military delegation came to him in December of '98 and said, don't worry about these NATO threats. He said, air campaign won't stop you. We used aircraft in Afghanistan. It didn't help us that much. He said, you need to do what you want to do. So he started this again back in January of '99. And we had a diplomatic observer mission in. And then 53 farmers were killed, murdered at Raychok. We went to Rambouillet. Hashim Thaci was there with the Kosovar delegation. But Milosevic wouldn't sign, as you said. So then we did the air campaign. And after that, we had to have a UN administration in Kosovo. And there were still troubles. Finally, 10 years later, we got independence. It's still not done. Kosovo doesn't have a seat in the United Nations. It still has frictions with its neighbor Serbia. And the mission continues,
So
as we would say.
we are slowly going into the present part of the situation, how it is today. But before going to that, I would like just briefly to ask you, what was the relationship at the time of the bombing between the NATO and your forces and the KLA, which at some stage started acting on the ground?
Well, there was no real relationship. NATO had no contact with the KLA. I think some member nations of NATO may have, through national channels, provided some limited assistance and some training to the KLA. Certainly it was helpful to NATO that the KLA could attempt to pose a ground threat, because it forced the Serb forces to mass, and that gave targets. And so by late May of 1999, when the KLA was attempting to push in from Albania and the Serbs were massing against them, we were able to target Serb forces.
Yeah. The war ended, and NATO troops are, I think, in the history of this country, the first ones that were received as liberators being foreign troops. There was no moment in our history that a foreign soldier was seen as a liberator. How do you feel as being perceived as liberator here? Do you feel?
It's a wonderful feeling. Yeah. It was an amazing feeling. Secretary General Javier Solano and I made a trip to Pristina. It must have been in mid-June and maybe late June, and then President Clinton made a trip in. And in both cases, we were so warmly welcomed. It was a wonderful validation of what we had sought to achieve by protecting the Kosovar Albanian population.
Did you ever contemplate that failing to do that was a possibility? Did it ever cross your mind that maybe, bombing is not going to end this, and this might end up being?
Well, I always believed that once you begin to use force, you have to use all the means necessary to be successful. So I had plans that I had coordinated and worked to bring in U.S. ground troops, British ground troops, German ground troops, Dutch ground troops, French ground troops. All the Allies would have contributed. We would have come in from Macedonia, we would have come in from Albania. We had done our reconnaissance, we'd prepared the routes, we'd looked at the shipping and transportation, we'd looked at the timelines, and we would have been into Kosovo before the first snow fell in the mountains in 1999, if that had been required. And President Clinton and Prime Minister Blair had agreed to do whatever was necessary. President Milosevic understood that meant ground troops. And I think that was the final leverage that encouraged him to give in the negotiations.
Yeah. Let's come to today's perspectives. How do you see Kosovo today? I mean, it's been almost 20 years after the war, 10 years of independence.
Well, first of all, it takes a long time to get over the feelings associated with conflict. So in every situation around the world, whether it be the American Civil War in the 19th century, or Rwanda in the 20th century, or Korea in the 20th century, the aftermath of war, the emotional scars, the cultural imprint lasts much longer than it takes to rebuild the buildings. So this is going to take a long time. I think if you recognize that, then you have to say the progress has been remarkable, really remarkable.
On the other hand, most of the people here are quite young. We have a very young population. More than half of the Kosovars are less than 30 years of age.
Right.
And many of them don't dwell too much on the past. They think about the present and
That's
the future.
That's a good thing.
It's a good thing, but then on the other hand, they also see the slow pace with which the country is being built, the enormous pressures that come from outside. You mentioned one of them being Serbia. and the fact that we are not fully recognized in the UN. But there are also internal pressures like the corruption, the level of unemployment, the different sorts of things which make people feel that this is not the full thing that we expected. You know, to be liberated is one thing and to be free, but to be independent seems to be another thing. How can one address these things faster? Because it seems to be indispensable to address them faster than they have been addressed.
Well, it's a matter of, in a democratic society, you have to do the electoral process, and you have to put people in office who can bring the country together and help it move forward. So you've just had another successful elections. The elections have been very successful in this country. You meet all the standards of free and fair elections, and I think both Europeans and Americans are very impressed with the progress in democratic standards. Every country has issues with corruption, including the United States. There's no corrupt-free society. It's intrinsic in human nature. So you step by step have to build institutions, and you have to educate people to recognize that unlike during the period of communism, where the most powerful people also had the most economic privileges, in democracy that's often not the case. Vice President Joe Biden in the United States during the Obama administration he was one of the poorest people in government. He lived solely on the salary that he received as vice president.
Well, maybe
he had no outside business interests whatsoever. And I think that's what people have to come to expect. In Eastern Europe, there's an unfortunate tendency in all these countries to carry on with the idea of communism, which meant that, hey, the president of the country, look, he's got this limousine, he's got his own helicopter, of course he's got his presidential thing, and I'm a minister, shouldn't I have this too? And you know, under communism, the nomenclatura, as they call them, had these special privileges. They had their dachas, they had all the trappings of wealth. And so, have to understand in democracy, the wealth comes from business. People have to learn that in democracy, it's public service. You're not expected to stay in office your whole life, and you're not expected
but that's exactly what is happening.
to make
I
your
mean,
future off the pay of government.
Yeah, but this is the problem for the people. It's exactly what is happening. I mean, the same
Well, of
people
course,
are running.
and it's all through, I see it, I do a lot of business in other countries in Eastern Europe. It's everywhere.
But
And so
that doesn't make it right.
doesn't make it right. Elections have, well, in the United States, in many cases, we have term limits in place. But where we don't, if people want to be congressmen for their entire lives, they can do that, but they're never going to become wealthy as a congressman. And they won't make much more than a first-year law graduate from Yale University makes with a big New York law firm. So as long as they're willing to live that way, then we want them in public service. But I don't think that's a bad thing. I think public service, you should live modestly. Now, if you're the president, of course, you have access to a government airplane and transportation and a house. But if you're a minister, you don't have your own public housing, and you live modestly. And if you aren't prepared to do that, don't go into public service. One of the things that caused problems in Europe is that there was a rule that you could be immune to prosecution if you were a member of parliament. And so people in Eastern Europe, and I'm not speaking here directly of Kosovo, but people in many countries flocked into parliament so they couldn't be prosecuted. Yeah. It's the wrong reason.
Gives them immunity
to be in public service.
I would like to link this with something that you have mentioned recently in an op-ed with Washington Post, because it seems to me that many of the leaders of the region, not only in Kosovo but also in the whole of the Balkans, I would say, are increasingly looking at Russia and Turkey as a model when it comes to how you run and govern the country. So. And you have been very critical about the influences that these two countries and some others can exercise here, calling even for US and EU to step up because the wars might erupt again in the Balkans if the West doesn't prevent them. So how do you see this? I mean, this Putin sort of model?
Well, I think we need greater Western involvement here. I think you need more presence. I think you need a European Union full-time mediator here to bring Kosovo together with Serbia to work through these issues so that Kosovo can get its rightful place in the United Nations, so that Serbia can then move on and become a member of the European Union, and Kosovo too eventually, so that there'll be full economic connectivity in this region. But to do that, of course, you have to go back to the basics. Now, government is constituted for what purpose? Is it to bring glory to the king and emperor? Are the peoples just like cattle to be used and abused by the most powerful? Or is the purpose of government to promote the common good and the general welfare for all the people? We believe the latter in democracies. And we believe that year in and year out, the democracy is the right way to go to best provide for the common good and the general welfare. If you have an autocracy where some man is super smart and super powerful and believes he should stay in office for year after year after year after year, inevitably that power will tend to bring greater corruption. And he will be a role model to emulate that will cause problems even after he's gone from the scene. No person is smart enough to take care of the general welfare by himself. It has to emerge from the competition of competing ambitions and conflicting interests. And that's the democratic process. Either a parliamentary system, as we have in many European countries, or a presidential system that we have in the United States and France. And these systems assure that competing interests have a voice and they remain alive and they're not crushed by an autocrat's fears and insecurities. You know, the longer autocrats stay in power, the greater their fear becomes, because the consequences of losing their position become greater. And this is a record proven throughout history. There's no example where it hasn't been the case. Whether you're talking about Peter the Great in Russia, he did some great things, but he was an autocrat, and some terrible things also happened under Peter the Great. Or the Genghis Khan with the Mongol horde. Genghis Khan may have been one of the greatest leaders of the 1,000 years between 1,000 and 2,000. He had a huge impact on human history. But in terms of the common good and welfare, what did he do for the ordinary person? Thousands died under these wars that he created in the conquest of China and in his descendants just coming into Europe. And so when you look at this, you have to believe that there has to be a better way than creating kings and emperors and autocrats. And that is education and giving voice to everyone so that everyone's interests can be taken into account.
So what you basically are saying that we are still in a fight for democracy here.
Yes.
And that there are chances this fight won't be won, that we could even lose it if there is no help and support from the West.
Well, you can lose it first if there's no awareness of what has to be done here. The basic fundamental responsibility for maintaining democracy rests with Kosovo itself. It is refusing the outside emoluments that people will give you. Don't take the bribes. Don't seek the extra money. Just because you're a leader doesn't mean you're entitled to a house in Monaco to be with the rest of the billionaires from Eastern Europe. Live modestly in government and help the country grow economically. your turn to participate comes when you get out of government. I was in government for 34 years after university, and then I went into business. And business has been good for me. But I never had any money while I was a person in uniform, and I wouldn't expect any public servant to become wealthy in his job.
As part of your career, I mean, apart from the astonishing almost 40 years in military, from Vietnam to Kosovo War, later on you turned to the politics as well. You have been also one of the candidates, presidential candidates, and you have been involved into discussing and analyzing policies. U.S. is enormously important for Kosovo, not only as a country which supports independence, but also as a force that can generate positive move on the global level. To what extent are you worried that the U.S. has turned to other crises and, I would not say forgotten, but maybe considers Kosovo to be not such a big problem, and to what extent the Kosovo and Balkans can suffer from this fact that Washington, the administration there, has its eyes elsewhere for much of the time?
Well, this is a risk, but this is not a risk unique to this administration. When I was the NATO commander, and before this bombing campaign, and Kosovo had all of this, the United States was focused on Korea and Iraq. And I was even told by a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that that's where they wanted to fight. There was no focus on the Balkans. And under the administration, even though it was President Clinton, the focus was elsewhere.
It was the first term.
Yeah. And then under President Bush, again, the focus was elsewhere. And under President Obama, the focus has been elsewhere. So I think under the circumstances, Kosovo has done extremely well. And I think it's now time to press for more active U.S. engagement and more active European engagement, because we now can see that Russia is more actively engaged in the region, as is Turkey. So the Balkans have always been, it's where the tectonic plates of humanity collide. It's civilizations, empires, invasions, forces, battles, savagery, tragedy. It's happened here too often. We can't let it happen again.
I mean, there are many people are also agreeing with you, saying that maybe European Union is too weak these days, with all the differences that they have more than before. And even the US is seen as a bit different from the time of the former president and even further President Bush or Obama or Clinton. What I'm asking is actually, would you feel, for example, that if a decision of 1999 to bomb Serbia would have been necessary to be taken today, would that be possible with the current circumstances that we have, with the kind of Russia that we have today?
First of all, remember that the Christmas warning that started this was done by the Republican administration of George H. Bush.
Yes, the senior.
And then it was followed through by a Democratic administration. The next Republican administration is the administration that advocated for and succeeded in NATO enlargement. So the Bush administration brought into NATO Romania and Bulgaria, the Balkan states, and under Obama, and we got further enlargement. And Montenegro has just become a member of NATO, which I'm very happy to see. And so I think there's been a continuing, although it's low-key, a continuity in U.S. interest in stabilizing this region. So I wouldn't say that U.S. re-engagement or deeper engagement is impossible. In fact, it might be highly possible if the Trump administration succeeds with North Korea and Iran. It might be very adept at encouraging Russia to encourage Serbia to work with Kosovo to solve these remaining issues.
You think that's possible?
I think
For
it's possible.
Serbia to agree
I think it's
on
possible.
Kosovo's independence?
I do think it's possible.
Because many people see almost the same names in the Serbian government today as they were in 20 years ago when you were in
It's
the war
true.
with them.
But underneath,
And
in
the language
Serbia,
seems to be from
the
time to time
population in
similar.
Serbia is changing the same as it's changing here. And young people have different ideas. And these young people see Europe as the future. They don't see Russia as the future. There's no wave of immigrants from Serbia heading to Russia.
No. There's a wave of immigrants from Kosovo heading to European Union
Yes.
because of the
And from
economy.
Kosovo to the
obviously.
United States.
Yes. To end this interview, which I would like to have gone on for hours and hours,
Right.
but of course you're a busy man. You just came and you have a lot of things to do here, people to meet. You are going to speak to the next generation of students here, and what would you say to the all young people of Kosovo who feel that freedom is an empty word if there is no real perspective to it, attached to the economy, attached to the education, and attached to the well-being, and at the end to the democratic process? What should they be fighting for so that the future of this country
Well, they should be,
is...
young people should be fighting for their future. You know, human hands built every institution in the world. Someone created the railroads, the highways. Someone's building these cars that are blocking traffic in Pristina at lunch hour. Someone imagined what a parliament would be and the restricted role that government should have. Somebody created these concepts and fought them through. Why can't this generation of Kosovars take what's been given and move the country forward? I say they can.
Well, General, thank you. Thank you very much for the words, and thank you for this interview. Thank you for being here. Hope to see you soon again.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Kjo ishte intervista me Generalin Wesley Clark. Falenderojmë Generalin dhe juve shikues të nderuar deri në shikimin e ardhshëm. Natën e mirë.